Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at China and trade. We are going to start way back in Chinese history and then kind of rush to get up to the Middle Ages stuff. So we'll cover a lot and then really focus on trade in the Middle Ages. Our essential question is going to be, what role did trade play in the rise and decline of China through the Middle Ages? So let's get into it. So going way back, China was more a regional area, a culture, and it was not unified in its early history. And for most of Chinese history, there hasn't been a single unified leader. Frequently, particularly in its early history, China was divided into numerous Chinese kingdoms, Chinese linguistically, Chinese culturally, but lots of different leaders. Now, periodically, a single kingdom would gain superiority over the others. These Chinese emperors would then rule a mostly united China, and solidify their control for a period of time. We would call these periodic times of a particular family controlling China a dynasty. And there were several emperors within these dynasties would try to extend their power. One of the early most powerful ones were the Han Chinese, the Han dynasty, which controlled a good chunk of what is today modern China. We see modern Chinese outlines here and the Han outlines in red. So a good chunk of modern China, except for the extremely mountainous areas over here. Now, around 300 CE, the two greatest empires in the world, hands down, were the Romans and the Han Chinese. The Romans controlling the Mediterranean basin and the Han Chinese controlling China and some of these inland trade routes. But both of them by 300 CE were collapsing, were falling apart. And the collapse of these empires led to mass migrations, people moving every which way, invasions of other people. And these people of Europe and Asia start to settle into these new, growing, smaller empires largely. Now, the Tang dynasty is going to be what starts to pull China out of their version of the Dark Age there after the Han. They're going to control and unify much of China. It looks like a different China than today, but a sizable part of the East Coast where the population of China lives was under Tang rule. And this was considered a high point of early Middle Ages Chinese power and culture. Now, much of this Tang wealth much of their power came from their wealth. They became extremely wealthy. And they became very wealthy because they were in control of the Silk Route. The Tang were the first to really understand the power of this trade route and really use their wealth to extend their military to control the trade routes to further extend their wealth. They were also the first to really go seaborne and to start exploring the world by boat. And they were able to push their trade toward Arabia, toward Africa. Now, as these new empires expanded, they made contact with a larger number of people. The more contact you have with more people means the exchange of more goods and more ideas. And we start to see the spread of Chinese ideas, goods, knowledge to Europe and to Arabia and back again. This trade leads to trade centers popping up, which leads to urbanization. That is the growth of these trade cities. They would really grow because of their wealth, their power, their connections to the world. And China is really going to benefit from this trade network because with silk in particular, but also other Chinese goods, they are in control of the most highly sought after, most demanded trade item in the world at that time. So most of the wealth is coming from the rest of the world toward China. Now, that trade network, the Silk Road, was extremely important. We've talked about this in previous lessons in European history, but scholars throughout the world have noted the importance of the Silk Road to their communities. Europe, Chinese, Indian, Ottoman, Mongol, Islamic history, they all reference this Silk Route as being essential to the development of their country. And this wealth really brought about the rise of numerous civilizations. So the benefits of trade. Trade centers, at these trade centers, merchants from around the world would come and get their best price for their goods. Okay, so these merchants are learning about the goods available around the world, taking back a fair portion of wealth or other goods to their homes. This trade allows people to have access to luxuries that they normally wouldn't have. Chinese pottery, as an example, Chinese silk, as an example. These were two of the top items. And merchants who would arrive seeking wealth would also bring wealth with them. And they would exchange, if they're coming from Europe, they might be exchanging olive oil and wine, which were desired in China, in exchange for these goods. So goods or knowledge are spreading. Now, these trade centers also attracted non-merchants, because if you're going to have a lot of merchants together in an area trading and exchanging goods, they're going to need other services too. So you get inns, you get places for them to sleep, wagon rights, people to fix their wagons, coopers to make barrels, tanners with leather, cobblers for new shoes. All different kinds of shops get set up in these medieval market towns that start to pop up all along the Silk Road, and especially in areas of China. This wealth becomes really important to developing the strength of that nation. Now, eventually, there are enough people there that more services are needed just to sustain those who serve the merchants. So if you have enough, wagon rights who are there, they're also going to need food. So farms start to build up around that community to feed the wagon rights who are helping the merchants, and so on and so forth. You have the development of towns and cities. This is urbanization. So all along the Silk Road and other trade routes, market towns are growing into cities. And the wealth of these cities are allowing this wealthy elite to develop. Okay, these are the upper class in the society, people who don't work, people who just spend their time focused on learning and thinking and exploring new concepts about the world. This powerful, educated class. And they produce the bureaucrats who help the government function and do its job well. And with this knowledge being accrued by this wealthy upper class, China becomes the wealthiest nation in the world during the Middle Ages. Now, this wealth was attractive to the Mongols. The Mongols are a group that we have discussed in this class before, and the Mongols want that wealth. So the Yuan dynasty is established after Kublai Khan, a Mongol, is able to complete the conquest of China and put all of China under Mongol rule. Kublai himself was one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan. And when that Mongol Empire broke apart, Kublai gets to be placed in charge of Mongolia and China. And from 1271 to 1368, China was controlled by Kublai and his descendants, called the Yuan dynasty. Now, it was during this time that Marco Polo, a Venetian Italian merchant and explorer, travels to China. He had heard about China. Mongols have now unified the Silk Road, so it becomes a lot easier to travel, safer to travel. And Marco Polo's like, we've heard of this place called China, but not nobody, but very few Europeans have ever been there, and even fewer have come back to talk about it. So Marco Polo travels and returns with stories about the wealth and the power of the Chinese, far beyond anything the Europeans had ever imagined. And this sparks European interest in China, and more Europeans want to get there, but it's very difficult to do, especially as the Mongols are declining. That Mongol decline was kind of complete, at least as far as China is concerned, in 1368, but it started in 1356 with a rebellion against Mongol rule, where this new group captures the southern capital of Nanjing down here. And by 1368, they're able to reunite much of China and establish a new dynasty, a Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty. And the first Ming Empire really does need to focus on these internal struggles, right? He's fighting this war against the Yuan, against the Mongols. But the second emperor, the Yongle emperor, is able to take control of a mostly unified China and focus on the outside. One of the things that is built during the Yongle emperor, his time, is something called the Chinese treasure fleet. And they put the Admiral Zhang He in command of this giant treasure fleet. More than 1,000 ships were in this fleet. Just imagine that, like 1,000 ships. And this fleet would travel the world, learning about other peoples and trading with them. The largest ships, and there were dozens in the treasure fleet, were about 1.5 football fields long. For scale, this is one of the Zheng He's treasure ships compared to the largest of Christopher Columbus's ships. Now, this is about 50 years before Columbus. We have a much larger Chinese fleet, dozens of these ships, in a fleet of hundreds to 1,000 ships compared to what Columbus was sailing in his day. Now, Zheng He will lead 7 different trade missions throughout the Indian Ocean and the islands of Southeast Asia, and even exploring the coast of Africa. His voyages will spread the knowledge of China and its wealth around the Indian Ocean. But the missions themselves actually bring back very little wealth for China, and they were extremely expensive to make all these ships. The problem was, during this time period, there's not a whole lot of wealth around this area of the world. China is really far and beyond above everybody else. So many Chinese scholars really didn't like what was happening. They saw it as a huge expense, and the only thing they were getting in return were knowledge and ideas about cultures that were definitively not Chinese, and they did not want these ideas spreading throughout China. Some feared that it would change Chinese culture. And so, following the death of the Yongle Emperor, Zheng He's fleet was burned. They burned all of their ships to say, we're done with the rest of the world. In the late 1400s, the Ming even outlaw the construction of ships. They are going to be a land-based empire. They have no interest in the sea. And furthermore, the Chinese are forbidden to leave China. So no more Chinese merchants are going to travel the Silk Road. It's a very isolationist mentality. So trade within China becomes strictly controlled. Foreign merchants couldn't enter Chinese borders. There were certain places, the island of Macau is an example, right here, this one little island, might be peninsula, where foreigners could trade, but that was it. That was their only access point to China. And trade ships, therefore, really decreased how much they were going. Now, as trade with China became more difficult, trade obviously declines, and the wealth of the Ming dynasty also declines. China is not going to be as wealthy if they're not trading. And this lack of contact with others also slows Chinese technology. Technology, which had been booming during the Middle Ages, really starts to fall behind others. And others, such as the Europeans, particularly in shipbuilding technology and weapons technology, will pass the Chinese in the late 1400s. And this will cause no end of problem for the Chinese. All right, that was it for today. More on trade coming up, but today I hope you learned something. I'll talk to you next time. Farewell.